you are currently paying for a ghost. Maybe it is that premium subscription you have not logged into since last summer. Or perhaps it is the vintage project car in your garage that has swallowed 3 months of your salary in parts and still refuses to turn over. You tell yourself that if you stop now, all that money and all that time was for nothing. You are not investing in a future anymore. You are just trying to bribe the past into making sense. You are a victim of a psychological glitch. It is a bug in the human hardware that makes us throw good money after bad, simply because we hate to admit we were wrong. But your personal losses are pocket change compared to the heist I am about to show you. Imagine that same irrational fear of quitting, scaled up to the size of 2 world superpowers. Picture it fueled by nuclear-age hubris and wrapped in the sleek, titanium skin of a supersonic jet. In the ledger of the 20th century, there is no greater monument to the sunk cost than the Concorde. It was a machine that could cross the Atlantic in under 3.5 hours, arriving in New York before it even left London. It was a miracle of engineering. It was a needle-nosed icon of the future that promised to shrink the world. But behind the champagne and the Mach 2 speed, it was a mathematical death spiral. It was a project that the British and French governments knew was a financial corpse as early as 1964. Yet, they kept pumping the lungs of this mechanical ghost for another 40 years. Why did they do it? Because they had already spent too much to stop. Let us open the case file on the Concorde Fallacy and reveal the shadow behind the success. The crime did not begin in a dark alley. It began in the gilded halls of power on November 29, 1962. French President Charles de Gaulle was a nationalist gambler, terrified of American aviation dominance. He wanted a flagship. He wanted a symbol that the old world still had teeth. His push for the Concorde was a direct, ego-driven strike against the United States. And so, the Anglo-French Supersonic Transport Agreement was signed. But it was not just a contract. It was a hostage situation. The treaty had a fatal mechanism. It possessed no escape clause. By international law, canceling the project was a literal act of treaty violation that could trigger massive diplomatic sanctions and brutal financial penalties. They were handcuffed to a falling rock. The pitch to the public was seductive. They would build a plane that flew faster than a rifle bullet. They estimated the development cost at 150 million pounds. To the taxpayers of 1,962, that was a mountain of gold, roughly $4 billion in modern money. It was an expensive gamble, but the experts promised a market for hundreds of these birds. They envisioned a world where every corporate executive and socialite would be a supersonic commuter. But the ink was not even dry on the treaty before the reality started to rot. The engineering was a nightmare. To fly at twice the speed of sound, you do not just build a faster plane. you have to reinvent physics. The engines had to breathe fire without melting. The airframe had to stretch 6 inches during flight, due to the sheer heat of friction baking the metal as it tore through the stratosphere. By 1964, the costs had not just risen, they had mutated. The estimated bill doubled, and then it tripled. The forensic fact is found in the confidential cabinet papers of the era. Treasury officials in London quietly delivered a brutal verdict. The Concorde would never make a profit. The market for supersonic travel was shrinking before the first prototype even took off. If this were a private business, the board would have burned the blueprints and walked away. But this was not business. This was national ego. Prime Minister Harold Wilson and President de Gaulle faced a choice: kill the plane or kill the math. They chose to abandon their fiduciary duty. They orchestrated a massive escalation of commitment. They told the public they were investing in the future, while behind closed doors, they were terrified of the bill they had already run up. You were the one holding that bill. Every penny poured into the Concorde fuel tanks was a penny taken from schools, hospitals, and the pockets of the very people who would never be able to afford a $10,000 ticket. The myth was innovation. The reality was a trap. The trap did not spring shut because of a mistake. It sprang because of a signature. In the world of high finance and state-run projects, a contract is not just a promise. It is a cage. And the 1962 Anglo-French agreement was a cage with no door. To understand the sunk cost fallacy, you have to look at it as a predatory loop. It is the mechanical vampire of economics. It feeds on what you have already lost to justify taking what you have left. In the case of the Concorde, the governments of Britain and France were not just building a plane. They were building a monument to their own inability to say they were wrong. The mechanism of this disaster followed a cold logic that you likely see in your own life, whether it is a failing relationship or a cratering stock portfolio. First came the overcommitment. By the late 60s, the investment was no longer just about aviation. It was about the survival of the entire European aerospace industry. Thousands of jobs were tied to the Delta Wing project. To cancel it was to admit that the future belonged entirely to the Americans. Next came the justification of the past. Every time a minister stood before Parliament to ask for more money, they did not talk about future profits. They talked about the massive investment already made. They argued that stopping now would be a capital destruction of the billions already spent. Finally, there was the denial of the exit. They ignored the flashing red lights on the dashboard because they were too focused on the rearview mirror. Let us look at the forensic evidence. By 1973, the development costs had ballooned to over £1 billion. That is an escalation of nearly 700% from the original estimate. But while the costs were going up, the potential for profit was being methodically dismantled. The biggest blow did not come from the engineers. It came from the atmosphere itself. When the Concorde broke the sound barrier, it created a sonic boom. It was a thunderclap that could shatter windows and terrify livestock. In response, the United States brought down a regulatory guillotine. They, along with several other countries, banned supersonic flight over their land. Imagine building a Ferrari that you are only allowed to drive in your own driveway. This single regulatory shift cut the Concorde potential routes by 90%. It was a knife to the throat of the business model. Originally, 16 airlines had placed options to buy 74 aircraft. They saw the future and they wanted in. But by the time the plane was ready for delivery in 1976, those orders had evaporated like jet exhaust. Pan Am, TWA, United, Qantas. One by one, they looked at the ledgers and walked away. The math was not just bad, it was fatal. Each Concorde carried only 100 passengers. Meanwhile, the new Boeing 747 carried 400. The Concorde burned twice the fuel, while selling 1/4 of the seats. Every time the Concorde took off, it was essentially burning pallets of taxpayer cash just to reach cruising altitude. The plane was too loud, too thirsty for fuel, and carried too few passengers. It became the world's most elegant white elephant project. It was a machine too iconic to cancel and too expensive to justify. In the end, only 2 airlines bought the Concorde: British Airways and Air France. And I use the word bought loosely. The governments essentially had to pay their own national airlines to take the planes off their hands. They provided staggering subsidies and wrote off the debt just to keep the dream in the air. This is the smoking gun of the Concorde fallacy. By the mid-70s, the project was a certified financial zombie. A 1974 report by the British government auditors stated plainly that there was no prospect of the project ever being profitable. Yet, politicians in boardrooms actively suppressed that reality. They chose to burn taxpayer money to save their own careers. They flew it for another 27 years. Why? Because of the psychology of the ledger. Loss aversion is a powerful poison. If you spend $100 on a concert ticket and wake up with a fever, you will likely force yourself to go anyway. You will sit in the rain, shivering and miserable, just so you do not waste the money. You are paying twice. Once with your money, and once with your health. The governments of Britain and France were doing the same, but with your tax dollars. They could not stomach the political fever of admitting they had spent £1 billion on a museum piece. They chose to bleed the public dry, rather than admit a mistake. They treated the Concorde like a holy relic, something too sacred to be judged by the boring rules of math. They turned a business venture into a religion of progress at any cost. But money is not infinite. Every pound poured into the thirsty Olympus 593 engines was a pound that did not go into more efficient, affordable travel for the masses. It was a theft of opportunity. While the Boeing 747 was democratizing the skies and making international travel accessible to the middle class, the Concorde remained a billionaire plaything. It was subsidized by the very people who would never set foot on its plush leather seats. They sold you the sizzle of the future to distract you from the fact that they were burning your house down to keep the pilot light on. The sunk cost is not just a term in a textbook. It is a psychological parasite that lives in the halls of power, convincing leaders that the only way out of a hole is to keep digging. The end did not come with a graceful descent. It came with a scream and a pillar of fire. On July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 struck a piece of debris on the runway at Charles de Gaulle. In less than 2 minutes, the miracle of engineering became 100 tons of falling wreckage. 113 people were gone. For the first time in its history, the Concorde was grounded. But the crash was merely the physical manifestation of a collapse that had happened decades prior. The forensic fact is that the Concorde was killed, not by a stray piece of titanium on a runway, but by the relentless weight of its own ledger. By the time the fleet was officially retired in 2003, the world had changed. The internet had made instant communication possible, and the 9/11 attacks had gutted the luxury travel market. Even the elite could no longer justify the $12,000 round-trip ticket for a cramped seat on a thirsty bird. When British Airways and Air France finally pulled the plug, the final tally was staggering. The total development cost, when adjusted for inflation, topped $30 billion. All of that for a fleet of only 14 commercial aircraft that never once turned a genuine, unsubsidized profit for the governments that birthed them. Today, these planes sit in museums, their long noses pointed at a future that never arrived. They are beautiful, they are fast, and they are the most expensive monuments to stubbornness ever built. But do not make the mistake of thinking this is just a story about airplanes. The Concorde is a ghost that still haunts your world today. If this story sounds familiar, it should. Today, billions are being poured into the artificial intelligence infrastructure boom. Venture capital keeps writing checks to startups that may never produce a profit. Governments are funding megaprojects, already 3 times over budget. They build digital vaporware not because the math works, but because too much money has already been spent to stop. The Concorde was not the last sunk cost empire. It was just the first one with wings. The Concorde fallacy is the hidden engine behind every government project that goes billions over budget, but is never canceled because it is too big to fail. It is the psychological tax you pay every time you refuse to walk away from a losing hand because you already have so much skin in the game. The system counts on your inability to cut your losses. It banks on the fact that you will keep paying the ghost tax, rather than admit you were robbed. The money you spent yesterday is gone. It is capital destruction. It has zero value in the decision of what to do tomorrow. The only question that matters is this: if you did not already own this investment, if you had not already spent a single second on this project? Would you pay a single dollar to start it today? If the answer is no, then every second you stay is a second you are choosing to be robbed. Here is the uncomfortable question. Was the Concorde a technological triumph, or the most beautiful financial mistake ever built? If it had been managed by a private company instead of governments, would it have been cancelled in 1964? Or do taxpayers always end up bailing out the world's most expensive vanity projects? Look at your portfolio. Look at your career. Ask yourself, are you building a future? Or are you just fueling a ghost? Choose carefully. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.